I'm Danny,
And I'm Rachel.
and we've been married for over 5 years now. If you're on the same page with the numbers, which are really the simplest thing, despite them being the reason that most relationships have problems, if you can at least get on the same page there, uh, you're going to be a lot happier.
I think the starting point is a shared bank account.
Okay.
I know it's maybe not trendy these days, but all of our money is flowing into a central location. And there's
Mhm.
no easier way to be on the same page than for that page to be like your bank account sheet.
Being intentional really has value because if you're not intentional with your money, it just blows away. Make a budget because it will improve your marriage and you will be able to work towards those common goals together.
Let's share with our listeners a little bit about you, a
Sure.
little bit about your relationship, and just kind of familiarize ourselves with the setting for what we're going to be talking about throughout the podcast, which is going to be marriage and money and how to get on the same page together.
I'm Danny,
And I'm Rachel.
and we've been married for over 5 years now. We met in college, and through mutual friends, Rachel came over to my apartment and ate pizza with me and my roommates. And eventually we started dating. Sometime after we graduated and got real jobs, um, we got engaged. And right before we got engaged, that's when I bought the house. So coming into our marriage, I had the house with a relatively small amount owed compared to what the two of us combined were making. And Rachel had a car note.
Yes. So I was a big time Dave Ramsey kid and
Okay.
young adult. So I had like a pretty strong foundation in thinking about finances and financial management and stuff like that. And growing up, my dad always said that we should never have a car note. But my car gave me one too many problems about 5 months before our wedding. And I had earmarked a certain amount of money for the wedding that was now fully committed. So I did end up with a car note. I know it
Fair
was
enough.
tough.
Scandal.
I
Yes.
called my dad crying about it. It was really hard for me, actually. So that's like the toughest financial decision that I made coming into our marriage. And like, that's probably the last car note that I'm ever going to have.
She paid it off within a couple months of us getting married, by the way, because she felt guilty about bringing bad debt into our marriage.
Yes, I wouldn't
Uh,
merge our bank accounts or like merge our financial life until I had this car paid off. I really felt like it was my problem and I needed to deal with it. And then like I was ready to come in full force.
Wow. That's a real thing, though, coming into marriage either with money or with a debt, and then feeling like you're responsible for the liability there.
yeah. So we were both fortunate enough that that's all the debt we had. So pretty close to a clean slate, especially compared to what you hear about people having nowadays, no consumer debt. I had one credit card, had a Discover card that I still have, and just that one card and paying my bills with it every month was enough that the bank would let me buy a house. So it really wasn't too much of a problem to build credit. Believe it or not, I think the bank wanted to loan me close to $500,000 for
I
a
believe
house.
it.
This is a kid. I was 24 at most, and they're like, "Oh yeah, with your income, this is what you can afford." Which now that would look a little bit different because rates have changed, but it was a rude awakening to me to be sitting there, getting a mortgage. Wait, how much? So I definitely understand how people get into a tight spot with debt. Again, both of us come from pretty frugal upbringings, and that helped a lot and kind of shaped how we handle money. But you hear about lifestyle creep, and I think that's where being intentional really has value because if you're not intentional with your money, it just blows away.
2 points that I heard. One was you're like, I'm just a kid. You're going to approve me for how much for this house? I think when you listen to financial gurus, say Dave Ramsey, they'll say you want to have no more than 25 or 30% of your gross pay going toward a mortgage or going toward your housing, right? That's kind of their general rule of thumb.
Mhm.
Your mortgage will approve you for much more than that.
Yeah.
It's very easy to become quote unquote house poor. And you don't want to treat what they're approving you on a mortgage as like the top of your budget for a home purchase, because it will put you in a spot where you're house poor. And the thing I really like triggered a light bulb for me was you said you were just a kid, you had a good credit score, and they were willing to give you how much just because of the credit score,
Mhm.
right? It didn't indicate anything about your life experience beyond the credit worthiness that FICO measures.
Mhm.
It didn't get into the stuff that they would have to sift through for manual underwriting. It probably enabled you to borrow a lot more than what traditional means would have enabled you to borrow. Do you think it's scary at all that by playing the game with the credit score and opening yourselves up to the ability to borrow so much more than is reasonably okay or affordable, do you think that's scary?
Definitely. I think that it is. It scares me more for other people. I stuck to a quarter. So before we were married, the mortgage was about a quarter of my income, including taxes and escrow, all that. Um, yeah. So after we were married, it was a very small portion, which made paying it off a lot easier. I was not responsible enough to be approved for that much money. Rachel had to talk me out of buying a supercar literally months before that. I was there's no way that you should be allowed. So to answer your question, yes, it scares me. I really liked the Acura NSX, and I saw one in person down at Country Club Plaza, and I was like, Rachel, I gotta buy this car. It's not gonna lose that much value over a few months. I'll just buy it and drive it for a few months, and then I'll sell it again.
You had car
Horrible,
fever.
horrible idea, and she talked me out of it.
Good for you.
Thank you.
I want to pivot though while we're on cars and we're talking about you talking Danny off the ledge here. That car note you had, how did that impact your marriage for that short while that you had it? Do you think things changed after you got the car note paid off?
I don't think so because we were so new into it. Like, we were still figuring out marriage as a whole. So it was kind of still in that season where you're like learning what it looks like to live together and like coming down off of the high of throwing this giant party and taking a cool honeymoon and everything. So I think it was just kind of part of that general adjustment phase. And I mean, at that point, when I made the decision to buy the car, like Danny was my fiance, like we were definitely moving that direction. So, like, he came with me to the dealership. He watched me negotiate to get more value out of my existing car. So, if anything, I think it was kind of a fun process for us to like do some of that adult stuff together.
Rachel's a very good negotiator. I am not. So the last time I bought a vehicle, I did it all over the phone, sight unseen, and then flew and drove it home.
That
Like
sounds like something I would
I
do. So Rachel's the negotiator. You are not the negotiator.
correct.
How did your financial lives look different before you were able to combine your strengths and engage with money together?
So I'm gonna go back a few years. I paid my own way through college. My parents had like a bit of money that they had set aside, but definitely not like full 4 years of K-State tuition. But I had a really strong ACT score. I got an incredible set of scholarships, some of which aren't even offered now, but I was able to put myself through school. So I had a lot of like hustle mentality, a lot of frugality built into that like early adulthood season when I was trying to figure out how to stretch those dollars through those 4 years. Um, I would say that it got a little looser and a little more lax in that early adulthood season when you're starting to get big kid paychecks. But despite some of that excitement about having big girl money, I think we threw a really cost effective wedding and we did a great job of communicating about it together.
Oh, good.
So I think planning a wedding together and not involving either of our sets of parents all that much set us up to have a marriage where we could talk about money because like right off the bat before we were married we had to talk about priorities and goals and budgets and things like that. So I think that's one of the most important things you can do for your marriage
You're
is to
saying.
plan your wedding with your spouse.
So Danny, how about you? What was your financial life like before marriage?
My parents were both very frugal. And so they kind of set that foundation for me growing up. Um, if you're in ag, farming, ranching, you pretty much have to be frugal because you have bad years, you have good years. I was fortunate enough to have grandparents who could help me financially with school, which was very nice of them to do. And so I didn't have any debt coming out of that. By nature, I'm a frugal person. When I was a kid, I would get candy at Christmas time, and I would still have some left over in summertime because I would just eat one a day. I wouldn't overindulge. And I started to lose that a little as I got older. And that's where I got into, I'd really like to have a new NSX. That seems like a frugal thing that I should buy. So I do think lifestyle inflation is a real thing, especially with social media and all the other things you see people doing. And it definitely had an effect on me, being into cars and that type of thing. You might see a YouTuber spend the money on it, and well, they aren't that much different from me. They just have a YouTube channel. So why shouldn't I buy whatever thing it is? And so I really think that that's where budgeting helped us. Also having a really really good wife who could kind of talk me back down on that type of thing. I think without being married, I would probably be in a way worse place financially because of that.
And I probably would too. I think the process of us working hard over those 2 years to pay our house off basically hit a hard reset on lifestyle inflation. I think it probably pulled us back 5 or 6 years worth of
Mhm.
lifestyle creep, and, like, now we were talking about this, and we called it the no muscle. I think we have a much stronger no muscle than we ever did in our adult life
Mhm.
because we had to practice that and because we had this built-in accountability to figuring out how to say no.
Does having a strong ability to say no make your yes in the budgeting and in marriage feel all the more beautiful?
Yes, because you're doing it on purpose.
Okay, you've already started talking a little bit about how your differences have balanced out and also what your lives might have looked like without marriage. But oftentimes there are opposites that attract. We've touched on negotiator, not negotiator. Is one of you more of the more inclined saver and one the more inclined spender? And how have you navigated communicating that so that your strengths mesh?
So I think both of us have kind of evolved over time.
Okay.
So I would say that coming into our relationship and marriage, I was probably more on the saver side, but I've grown to a point now. You asked about this yes and the sweetness of yes. I want to do it on purpose, but I am prepared to spend like an amount of money I'm comfortable with for something that brings me meaningful value. And so it's not spending for spending's sake, but I'm also not afraid to, I mean, kind of relish this season where we have paid our house off and we're both working and we have our health. It's kind of like a little mini retirement in the middle of life.
That's cool. How about you, Danny?
It feels good to save to me. It feels good to see a nice balance like in your account, right? I was talking about this earlier that it's a lot of fun to carry physical money. So a lot of places now will have some amount of service charge for credit cards, especially small businesses. And it's very satisfying when you spend physical cash to know that you're still spending money, but it's not gonna pull your account balance down. That's already out of your checking account, and it's really satisfying. I was telling Rachel, I went in and, looked at my credit card statement, and under this month, it said, "No recent activity," and that's a really good feeling.
Mm.
Having that clean slate is nice, and once when we were paying our house off, that was a pretty common thing. And so it feels good to be making progress. It feels good to save. And again, it feels good to give also. And, being intentional with your money allows you to do that. If you're not intentional, ultimately, I think you're going to get a lot less for your money.
Yeah.
Do you think the budget is the best way to get on the same page with your intentions?
I think the starting point is a shared bank account.
Okay.
I know it's maybe not trendy these days, but all of our money is flowing into a central location, and there's no easier way to be on the same page than for that page to be like your bank account sheet. So I think that's a really great start because by nature, you kind of have some recognition that this impacts me, but I also now know very clearly how this impacts my spouse every single time I make any financial decision.
For someone who's really on the fence about that or really resistant to combining finances with their spouse, what advice would you give them? How would you encourage them to move forward with this very powerful way to be on the same page?
Ooh, I'm gonna challenge your premise here. Is this someone who's already married or someone who's thinking about marriage?
Someone who's already married
Someone who's already married.
and they've maintained separate bank accounts to this point.
You've already committed your whole lives to each other, your whole heart and soul in sickness and in health till death do you part. Like, what's a few dollars and cents alongside all of that?
So for someone who's still in the dual income, no kids section of life, think about how good it feels to see both of those paychecks hit the same account. It's a pretty powerful feeling, I think. You're a couple, you're working towards the same things. And I think those goals that you have can feel a lot more achievable to see the money coming into the same place and leaving the same place. It made us feel a lot more like a team.
Oh,
Um,
definitely.
and there were, a few sacrifices we had to make, but ultimately I think we felt more together and more we felt more like teammates working towards a common goal. But yeah, imagine how good it would feel to have that all going to the same place.
So the combined bank account is the most powerful way for you in your experience to be on the same page. What are three habits that have grown out of that have really helped you stay on the same page beyond combining your money?
Budgeting to pay off the house was something that came out of that shared bank account. So, to Danny's point, seeing that combined pool of resources that we have, it was a little intimidating to think about how we were going to steward those resources.
Mm.
And so this seemed like a really organic next step that also helped us like lean into having a really clear like mission, like a battle that we were fighting together. More recently, so I'm working on my master's degree right now. And so I've had to learn time management in a whole different way. And so a few months ago, we implemented what we're calling our WAG meeting. WAG stands for week at a glance. And so
Oh.
I made this nice like Microsoft Word document with exactly the layout I wanted. And we lay out every single day's dinner and plans, and we do a grocery list, and we do our prayer intentions, and we do our to-do list. And so that has been, I mean, because we've gone through so many just like structured conversations around the budget, that's now folded into thinking about time management, being on the same page that way.
That's cool. It's like a budget for your time on like a weekly basis, doing a WAG.
Yeah, yeah. So food planning, meal planning, time planning, it's actually been a really cool thing for us because at the time when we were budgeting, I feel or like budgeting for paying off the house. I feel like we weren't super organized about eating specifically. And so we'd have a decent amount of like girl dinners, right? Like a little bit of like chips and salsa type situation, a bit of charcuterie. There were plenty of evenings where jalapeno poppers on the couch were dinner. But I wish that we would have started doing this WAG, like meal planning and organization so much sooner. We haven't quantified it, but I can't even imagine the amount of money that we've saved just in thinking through, I'm going to buy this much chicken for the week and we're going to like batch it out and smoke all of it at once. We're going to use it in 3 different recipes and things like that. Like we've been able to be so much more intentional with even that little piece of our life.
That's cool. So is that one out of three, or was that all of the habit?
WAG was one of the 3.
Okay, so WAG is habit number one.
Budgeting was kind of like the initial habit,
Okay, got it.
folded into everything else. Oh, we also both separately, this isn't like a meeting or anything, but we both look at our bank account pretty much every day. And so it kind of builds in that like regular accountability and also like it's a super easy way to stay on the same page. Like you both know what you're working with at any given point.
I think ultimately a lot of the time it just comes down to communication, and numbers are a very easy way to communicate. So if you can be on the same page from the same bank account, it makes that communication a lot easier because you're both looking at the same thing. And I think for us, it's it's made us better communicators, but it's also ultimately just made it a lot easier. Life in general is easier if you're tackling it together, and so that's something that's allowed us to do.
So someone said you shouldn't ever pay extra on the principal month over month. And this would be really interesting because, correct me if I'm wrong, but you've paid your home
That's
off.
correct.
Yep.
That's incredible. So they said the best, fastest way, if you have one of those low interest rate mortgages below 3% or 3.5%, is to don't put extra on the principal. Take the money, put it in a high yield savings account. And once you have enough money in the high yield savings account to pay off the balance, then decide whether you want to get rid of the mortgage at that point or not. And I ran the numbers on last week's episode and found it is faster in many cases by like a couple months and over the span of 10 to 15 years depending on the parameters, but you also pay more interest over time
Mhm.
because you're not accelerating the transition from more interest less principal to more principal less interest as you would if you're paying extra. So there were trade-offs, and I discussed the trade-offs therein. But what kind of reaction would you have to someone saying you should never pay extra on the principal? Everyone needs to go and put X amount into a savings account instead and then pay it off in a lump sum.
So I love that for people who are going to live in the space of perfect discipline all the time. But I think people leave out a discipline piece when they're talking about all of these different, like, financial, wizardry wrangling type of things that they want to do, right? Like, ultimately for us, making a super aggressive budget, having a built-in accountability buddy in a
Mhm.
marriage, like, that was a great way to keep us focused on paying off our house. And I think if we would have had that 1-2 step, it would have been a lot easier to say, "Oh, I don't feel like doing that this month because we want to XYZ, take a vacation."
If you have a high yield savings account that's doing really well, that's great. But also knowing human nature, I wouldn't be surprised if some of that money starts to come back out a time or two. And
Right.
so for us, what worked really well was setting a budget and ultimately just getting it done. Part of that made that possible was cheap house. And houses are a lot more expensive now, but you can still get relatively cheap ones. You can still get good deals, and ultimately, you might not like the way it looks, but you can probably pay it off faster than you think. I bought the house in probably 2018. We refinanced it in spring of 2020, even with the closing costs of refinancing the house, and even then with paying it off within 3 years of that 15-year, that change to the 15-year still paid. So I would encourage people, if nothing else, look at refinancing to a shorter rate if you can. Like if it can fit in your budget. Um, a lot of people say that's the only way you should ever do it. Well, when I was 24, I didn't know that. Um, it it definitely makes a big difference.
And to your point about people potentially taking money back out of that high yield savings account in that event, I think that's a super reasonable concern.
It
Like, once
is.
you put it toward the mortgage payment, it's gone. Like,
Right.
it's not your money anymore. Like, it's home equity, which is awesome.
And that is people's concern.
Yeah.
It's just not as liquid. And
Yeah.
that's kind of what I talked about last week is for some people it's a pro to have the money in a savings account where you have the flexibility. But for someone who's really adamant about paying the home off, having it where it might slip away to another priority that's more spontaneous is a con. Yeah, so it kind of depends on the people. Here's something that I think is interesting. If you were saving up the lump sum and you're going to go and pay off the home, like you did, redo the journey, and you did it in one lump sum, do you what would the emotional journey be like for each of you? Like letting that much money go to paying off the mortgage in one snap, because that's very different than putting like $200-300 extra a month into the principal.
I think it would be brutal. Like, we lived in a space, I don't want to say we, I won't speak for Danny, but I think I lived in a space of just like a little bit of psychological unsafety in that season where we were paying aggressively on the house because it's not like we ever had a ton of money in our savings account. like we were always in a spot to be fine, and we always knew that the next paycheck was coming, realistically.
Right.
But I mean, like, we didn't have some type of sinking fund that was going to replace my car with a nice car if something went wrong. And so I think if you're in a situation where you've saved up your entire home principal and then you get rid of it all at once, it would be a very jarring experience from a psychological safety perspective. Because, like, it's your money up until you get rid of it, and then it's not anymore. And $150,000 all at once would feel wild
It
to
would.
get rid of.
Do you agree? Or do you
Yeah,
think it would be easier for you?
I agree. Do keep in mind when we were paying off the house, we were putting half of our income towards it, which again, we were very fortunate to be able to do that. Um, Thanks COVID, I guess. You can't really
We weren't doing much else.
couldn't go to Hawaii. But yeah, we were putting most months about half of our income, like after tax income, towards the house. I don't think many people would put half their after tax income in a high yield savings account.
No.
I'm sure there's some people who are mentally able to do that, but most aren't. They just see the money sitting there and they want to spend it.
That's kind of normal for people in the FIRE crowd,
Mhm.
where they're saving that money for early retirement.
Sure.
They might get to 40 or 70, 80% savings rates and really cut back their lifestyle. But for anyone outside of that crowd, yes, putting half your income toward a mortgage is a very aggressive, and that just hearing that might be a shock.
And it was, I mean, for us, it worked out really nicely because from a, you could almost call it speculative standpoint, your common argument that you always hear is you could put that in the market.
Right.
Sure, but most people I don't know have put, what their house is worth into the market in any given point. Um, but the advantage to it for us is that we got lucky and it ended up beating the market. That usually doesn't happen. Um, but over the time we paid the house off, the money that we put towards the house beat the market by about 15%, which is
Wow.
wild. Market usually doesn't go down that way.
Yeah.
But that's a weird side note.
The comparison I normally make when it comes to paying off the mortgage or investing is when you're paying the mortgage off, you know exactly what you're going to get out of it when it comes to the reduction in interest that's being charged.
Mhm.
That is finite, and it's, to use a near forbidden word, guaranteed.
Mhm.
It is. It's basically a known return.
Right. Meanwhile, investing in the market is an unknown return, so you'd have to correct it for some semblance of risk there. And also maintaining that mortgage for a longer period of time holds on to the risk that the mortgage is as a liability.
Mhm.
So
And if you like high yield savings accounts, you might like being able to put money for your property taxes, for your insurance payments in one of those instead of handing it over in escrow to your mortgage company. So they get to do the same thing with it. I really didn't like escrow. I know you can get out of it. It did play into
Yeah.
paying the house off. And then I immediately forgot to pay the property taxes on the house. So, yeah,
I
I'll remember next year.
I did about half and half for that. I kept the property taxes in escrow when we got this house, but I
Yep.
pulled the homeowner's insurance out and paid that one separate, kind of controlled it because I bundled it with the auto insurance. And it's like, well, I know I can remember that one. That one's going to be there, and I'll leave the other there. We'll kind of do half and half and see how we like it.
It's in a savings account for next year, so I won't be able to forget it because I'll start thinking, man, sure, a lot more money in this savings account than there should be. Hopefully,
Do you have it earmarked with a sinking fund that says property taxes?
throughout budgeting, we did a few different sinking funds. One that I think a lot of people overlook is vacation. That's a really good sinking fund, but all your, various insurances and that type of thing. So one account, but we accounted for it, and that really did help. While we were working down the mortgage, we did go on vacation,
Mhm.
and it was a cost reduced vacation. Probably half of what we would have normally spent. But there were upsides to that. You can do a lot more with less than you think.
And it was a great vacation.
Yeah.
We were going like one night in a tent, one night in a hotel, and then back into the tent. And so we got to camp in these beautiful places, save some money on food because we'd like cook some at our camp spot instead of going out to eat at a restaurant. So it was a super cost effective vacation, but will probably always be one of my favorite vacations that we've taken together. It was beautiful. Everything went right on that vacation.
So are you familiar with what I call hope-filled frugality?
Mm-hmm.
The facet that this reminds me of is maximizing your happiness per dollar spent, saved, or given. Like going for an inexpensive vacation that you enjoy almost as much, if not more, than an expensive vacation seems like a very hope-filled, frugal thing to do. And it makes me smile whenever I hear someone mentioning something like that. So thank you.
Of course. I would recommend it to anyone.
Anyone whose back can hold up to sleeping on an air mattress in a free tent. You
Yes.
can get most any piece of camping gear for free. You can have a very frugal camping vacation.
Right. There's a hot take. You can get almost any piece of camping gear for free. I love that.
In terms of frugality, there's a lot of things that you would never consider until there's a need, right? And so you might not really think about, oh, I can just go camp on federal land for free on my vacation when you're surrounded by $200 a night hotels, which is a cheap hotel these days. And so that let us kind of explore other options and have a good time with it. And now that's something that we picked up along the way for our future vacationing.
What has been the hardest financial compromise since you've been married?
Yes. So this isn't going to feel like a compromise in like how most couples are going to talk about compromise. So we were on the same page about this decision basically from the get-go, but partway through paying the house off, I also started my master's program. So suddenly we were diverting a meaningful chunk of money from this house payoff project to now also paying for my grad school. So we were still on pace with the house, but it did kind of force us to figure out, get a little more creative with that budget and figure out how this was all going to work.
Do you have anything to add to that?
I think what we talked about earlier with the no muscle really helped with that, because it was, in addition to the financial side of it, I there were more things that I had to do because Rachel was busy with school, which is not unlike, someone having a kid or anything. It's nowhere near that intensive. But I was in a pretty good position to do that successfully because I was ready. We were already communicating really well. We knew where the dollars and cents were going. And so in general, I think I expected it to be way more stressful than it was. And it hasn't been all that stressful so far for me. I'm not the one doing homework, so I'm sure it's more stressful for Rachel, but it made it less stressful for both of us.
Here's a quick question. If you weren't budgeting with it and you decided to go the same route, do you think you'd be way more stressed out?
Oh, all the time.
If we weren't budgeting when Rachel started grad school, for one, we wouldn't own our house.
In a season where I'm trying to juggle like multiple things with school and work and like just being married, right? Because you should always be investing time in your marriage. Like, I don't have to worry about money. Like, we just kind of took that worry off the table in paying our house off. And so the amount of peace and bandwidth that I opened up to then dedicate to school has made it much more manageable.
In part of what I do with the marriage preparation thing coming up here with Amanda, we talk about how money fights and money problems are a serious strain on marriage. However, there are some stats that say that couples that talk about money regularly in a healthy way, in a positive way, are 80% or more likely to say that they're in a happy marriage. So how do you differentiate between a money fight and then a healthy argument? Because in marriage, arguing is a good and healthy thing, right? It can be. It can help you really sort through some serious communication. So how do you differentiate between money fights and healthy arguments?
I think at the macro level, you're talking like proactive versus reactive here. Like, if you're having a money fight that feels like it may be in a reactive space, where like a financial discussion, with any luck, is something that you get to do proactively. And because we, took the steps a few years ago to start budgeting really aggressively and to pay our house off, I feel like we just don't have money fights. We've been able to build a life where we don't have to have a money fight. We've built some really strong, communication avenues and some really good habits that let all of those things be a financial discussion.
Rachel hears this from me a lot, but numbers are pretty simple. So if you can't agree about the numbers, it's going to be really challenging to agree about other things. And things are complicated. There's always going to be external factors that affect your marriage. And if you're on the same page with the numbers, which are really the simplest thing, despite them being the reason that most relationships have problems, if you can at least get on the same page there, uh, you're going to be a lot happier.
A lot of the other puzzle pieces fall into place. Has having good communication, conversations around money helped you with conversations around other other facets of life?
I think so. I think kind of what we established over that like big full court press process was we got to see each other like kind of at our best working toward this common goal,
Mm.
and it built a different kind of trust. Like I have a different trust that Danny has my best interest at heart in seeing how he was willing to put like this, that, and the other aside to like fight this dragon with me. And so I think that kind of has had ripples through our whole marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure that's mutual for you too, Danny.
Yeah, definitely. Rachel's a very hard worker. She has never given anything less than 110% at anything. Because when we started that whole process, we hadn't been married that long. Um, Obviously, COVID happened just a few short months into our marriage. And so we were spending a lot more time with each other than we expected to. And things were very different, uh, very different compared to what we were expecting in the world. And so it probably was I think when Rachel brought up the idea initially of paying off the house, it was kind of jarring at first, and then I started thinking about it and thought, this makes a lot of sense. This woman really cares about me. She wants me to have a nice roof over my head. And so I definitely agree that it led into a lot of trust, and I think that's kind of inevitable when you're working towards the same thing together.
With that, I'm really curious. What's something significantly valuable that you've learned from your spouse, especially in the context of money?
So for me, Rachel taught me a lot about investing, which she kind of works in a business financial space. The importance of contributing towards retirement accounts. Obviously, I kind of already understood saving. Everybody understands that, but the importance of investing, I guess, was kind of lost on me. Uh, Not many people in my family have retired. We like to work. I'd like to be in a position where I continue to do work that I enjoy for my whole life. But I would definitely say that the importance of investing and to invest early, invest often, is something that Rachel taught me.
And something I've learned being married to Danny is the value of being able to do it yourself. So, like, this is something that I've gotten to learn and also get a benefit from, like, all the time without having to be hands on. So, Danny always changes my oil. I don't have to go pay for oil changes anymore. And there's just a million little things that way. So, my favorite was I think this was even before our big home payoff project. Danny bought a mower on Facebook Marketplace, and it was fine, but not great. And then something, I don't know, it met its final end, except it wasn't final for that mower because he found a different mower on Facebook Marketplace with a working engine and did an engine swap in our driveway. And now we have this Frankenstein mower that is still our mower like 4 years later. So it's been really fun to see, like, what mechanical competence and just, like, general ability to do stuff does, like, not just for your sense of self, but also for the bottom line.
I love that. We were talking earlier when you came over about the fan project that we
Yeah.
did. I'm sure that connected right along those same lines.
Oh,
Yeah, there's a lot you can do yourself. Other times you should hire a professional, but when it comes to swapping parts from one literally worthless mower to another worthless mower, you really can't make it any worse. Just go for it, and don't go to the lawnmower dealership and take out a loan on a mower. That's not what you should do.
That's one thing I've I found inspiring when I'm normally hesitant to do a DIY project is I can't make it worse. Might as well try.
It was either I work on the mower and improve it, combine two mowers into one, or I buy whatever the cheapest push mower that you can get, but two of them. And the two of us, I think in about an hour and a half, 2 hours, could probably get our yard mowed with a couple push mowers. That would have been the alternative.
As we wrap up, I want to know, you've been married for a little bit now. What advice, if you could go back to day one, would you give your newlywed selves?
So I think for me, the thing that stands out really is budgeting. The communication starts there. The goal setting, all that can start with a budget. And it's our advice to all the newlywed couples in our lives. Usually people ask you for advice, which I think it's kind of silly to ask somebody who's only been married for 5 years for marriage advice. But our response for both of us is always make a budget, because it will improve your marriage and you will be able to work towards those common goals together.
Mm.
And I'm going to pull a wild card here. So, the advice that we always give is make a budget, and I stand behind that wholeheartedly. But if I were to walk up to the people that we were on August 17th of 2019, I wouldn't do anything differently. Knowing what I know about how the next few years or even the next few months would go, sure, like we were probably a little irresponsible and silly as we settled into early marriage, but the whole world shut down 6 months after we got married. And I think in that specific context, it's kind of great that we could just be a little loose and free for those 6 months. So, I wouldn't do anything differently, but everyone else should make a budget.
I think it's really easy to underestimate how much good being able to set common goals and priorities together is. You've talked about budget meetings. I think that's a great way to do it. Rachel mentioned our week at a glance meeting, and that's effectively what that is. It's just a mini budget meeting. You're not surprised when your spouse has class one night or has a meeting they need to go to. Um, it does help. And I think that the more you can flex those communication muscles, the better off you'll be.
That's wonderful. I'm first going to steal the week at a glance thing. We're going to see if we can, because life's been a little chaotic now. We could really, really benefit from that. Second, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for being on the show. Thank you for coming on and sharing your story, how you've gotten on the same page with money in a very beautiful marriage. It's an honor and a privilege to share your wisdom and everything that you've come here to share with everyone listening to the show.
Yeah, thank you for
so
having
much
us.
for having us.
It's an absolute honor. And until next week, until next Tuesday, budget bravely and enjoy your hope-filled financial future.